As a massive Spider-Man fan, I've been highly anticipating Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man since it was announced, back when it was called Spider-Man Freshman Year. Well, it's finally arrived, and after some good press, some bad press, your typical normal Spider-Man fan reactions, and all 10 Season 1 episodes delivered over 4 weeks, it's finally time to talk about the show. Was it what I expected? Did its ties to the MCU hold it back? Is it the best animated Spider-Man show of the Disney era? Spoilers, yes, very easily. Let's untangle the web and talk about Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man Season 1. And hey, if you like my Spidey takes, I've got a ton of other Spider-Man videos covering various other animated series, the movies, the Spider-Verses, the games. Check them out if you're into it. The Spider-Man 67 video in particular deserves a little more love, I think. Thanks. Heads up, there are going to be spoilers for the entirety of Season 1 throughout this video, but first we'll be talking in broader strokes about the presentation of the series, the characters, the general premise, and then diving into the specifics. And I think the obvious place to start is the animation. Going in, a lot of the critical emphasis has been placed on the animation. They first revealed the concept art for the show back in 2022 with its former title, and if it isn't obvious, it was fully inspired by Steve Ditko's classic Spidey art style of the 1960s. For me, personally, the prospect of having a full series that draws from the original run was wildly exciting, particularly after X-Men 97's animation managed to blow me away, so I was just losing my mind thinking about how great a 2D Ditko-inspired Spidey series could look. And then, obviously, it was revealed that the show is 3D animated, which to many is a huge bummer, and to many others, a deal breaker. And while I definitely wish we had gotten to see this art style come to life in a 2D series, I think they've managed a lot of really impressive stuff with the 3D for 2D style here. The swinging sequences in particular are incredibly dynamic. They've created a ton of beautifully cinematic shot choices with these visuals, and the fight sequences, particularly as the show moves deeper into the season, are truly some of the best in animated Spidey history. There are so many jaw-dropping moments that we'll get into in more detail later, and to its credit, nearly any given screen grab of the series does look a lot like that concept art. It's really just the motion that makes it all feel a little bit off. The expressions of the characters are kinda, well, non-expressive in this style. Some of the body movement is very stiff, but again, I think the show really makes up for this in its cinematic choices and dynamic action. I also think when the show pointedly decides to move into a more stylized territory, like in the intro sequence, it looks really awesome. But let's talk about the entire conceit of this show. The characters, the premise, the universe, because though visually it's clearly inspired by the classic run, this thing is pulling from a lot of places you might not expect for a Spidey adaptation. And I think the most glaring difference is that not only is the supporting cast of this version of Spidey wildly different than the source material, but even wildly different than the MCU's already varied cast of characters in those Spidey movies. No Gwen, MJ, Liz Allen, or Flash in any variation, whether that's MCU or comic versions. No Ned yet, we'll get to that. Instead, we've got a group of kids who have been pulled from all over the Marvel map. Peter's best friend is Nico Minoru, who first appeared in Runaways. I don't actually know a ton about this character firsthand, but she seems to be of the magical sort, though they're only hinting at that so far in the series, heavily hinting, to be fair. There's Pearl Penguin, who is a hero known as Wave in the comic books, but thus far is just another fellow student. And then we get to the actual Spidey side characters, and they make some really interesting and inspired choices here. For one, we finally get a Harry Osborn, who has a bit of a modern rich kid twist implemented. He's basically a social media influencer who flexes his wealth. Honestly, a kind of fitting way to bring the character into 2025. I'll dive more into how much I enjoyed his implementation into Peter's story in a little bit. It also obviously heavily involves Norman Osborn, and I've got tons to say about how much I love this portrayal of Norm so far. Again, we'll get there. And probably the most important side character, interestingly, a character who could honestly be considered a co-lead alongside Peter with the way the season is structured, is Lonnie Lincoln, who is of course known as Tombstone in the comics. His journey parallels Peter's throughout this entire season in an honestly ingenious way. There's so much to talk about there, I'm going to do an entire section about it. There are also a handful of other supporting characters that are pulled from all around the Marvel Universe. Peter's got a handful of fellow interns at Oscorp who are plucked from around the Marvel Universe. Asha from Wakanda, Jean aka Finesse, Amadeus Cho, who became the totally awesome Hulk in the comics. Again, they're really pulling from all over the place in this adaptation, which on one hand, I can understand pure Spidey fans being frustrated with, but personally, I'm already so impressed with the way they've remixed this Spidey world without betraying the core tenets of the character, so I'm really eager to see where they go with a lot of these characters. What they've already done is honestly such a difficult tightrope walk, and they've managed with nearly zero stumbles so far, which I think is as good a time as any to talk about how this show draws from the MCU. This show is a Marvel Studios animation production, and therefore it exists in conversation with the current Spidey we know from the MCU. While yes, this film does exist in a separate universe/timeline from the MCU, it still somewhat exists within the framework of the MCU. MCU, and I do think the route they've gone is really interesting, particularly the attention to detail in how they've executed why this universe plays out so differently. The big idea behind this show was initially framed as, instead of Tony Stark recruiting Peter for a quote-unquote internship during the events of Civil War, what if it was Norman Osborn? And that is the big important event at the end of the very first episode. However, the way in which this universe gets there is also really brilliant. The show starts right before Peter's very first day at Midtown High, but just as he arrives at school, bam, Doctor Strange portal, Venom symbiote over some kind of alien, huge fight that absolutely destroys a huge chunk of Midtown High. And also, the spider that bites Peter drops out of this portal, and this is where he gets his powers for the first time. While yes, this universe does differentiate from the MCU in other ways as well, this event is exactly what changes the trajectory of Peter's story so drastically, and you can trace it all pretty brilliantly. For one, this event is how he saves and then meets Nico Minoru, who becomes his best friend in this universe. Two, this is smaller, but we don't know exactly when Peter got his powers in the MCU, but we can presume that it happens slightly earlier in this universe because of this event, and it being on his first day of high school. Three, because Midtown High is partially destroyed in this event, Peter actually starts attending a different high school, Rockford T. Bales High School, along with Nico. This leads to an array of changes for Peter's world. This is where Lonnie and Pearl attend school, and is likely also why we don't see his MCU supporting cast like Ned, MJ, or Liz Allen hanging around. But most importantly, because Peter is now attending a completely different school in a different location, he runs into and saves none other than Harry Osborn from some punks en route to school one morning, something that would not have happened in his MCU routine. This is pointedly what puts Spider-Man on Norman Osborn's radar, and therefore what creates that new inciting incident in this alternate universe where Norm recruits Peter instead of Tony. And yes, as I mentioned, there are other differences between these universes as well, but I just thought that the clear through line of these series of events leading to the whole conceit of this series was incredibly well plotted and well structured. And I also understand how tying this to the MCU at all might seem annoying to people. It's kind of like, well, make it the MCU or just make it its own thing entirely. I do think this is a pretty impressive way for the series to have its cake and eat it too. It basically allows them to use the major events of the MCU as a backdrop for the series, which means that the fans can largely have pretty specific reference points for what's happening around the rest of the Marvel universe without having to explicitly spell them out for this specific universe. So the setting is largely already understood for the fans as long as we've got a reference point, but the specifics have a lot more leeway so they can tell their own stories and bring in their own elements that the writers want to explore. This season is largely set during the Civil War conflicts. We get explicit references to the airport fight, to Captain America being on the run, and more consequentially, the Sokovia Accords, which obviously may end up affecting Peter. But let's start diving into the minutiae of the show, because while I love Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, a lot of these elements that I grew to like did need to win me over. The first step is aptly titled Amazing Fantasy, an obvious reference to Amazing Fantasy 15, the first ever appearance of Spider-Man. In fact, the intro sequence's cover for this episode is recreating AF-15, but with Spidey saving Harry in his prototype suit. This is another small decision that kind of blew my mind. Every episode has its own title screen in the style of a comic book cover, you know, only in 16:9 instead of comic book sized. Has any other comic book show done this? Because it's just such an obviously smart decision, and I can't believe I haven't seen it before. Right off the bat, the show introduces us to Peter's home life and this version of Aunt May, who is expectedly designed after Marissa Tomei. I do love, however, that her voice actress Kari Wahlgren puts more of a New York accent on May than Tomei did. Feels right.
It's your first day. If one of us is gonna be late, I'd rather it's me.
It's also nice to get a pretty immediate mention of Ben as May drives Peter to school. I know it really bothers people that the MCU seems allergic to explicit Ben references, and I think the creative team wanted to make sure they got one in early here.
Things have been different without having Uncle Ben around, but you've always been here for me. You have always had my back.
And honestly, even beyond just making sure Ben gets a nod here, I think this also goes a long way to firmly establish Peter and May's dynamic in this universe. Knowing this is based on the framework of the MCU, in which May sort of takes on Ben's inspirational role in Peter's life, this scene also establishes that May's support is vital to Peter's development in this world, particularly knowing that Ben has already passed and that Peter has not yet gained his powers, meaning that Ben's death couldn't have happened in the same way it did in the comics, resulting from Peter's selfishness. Obviously, it remains to be seen if May's fate in the MCU will be matched in this world, but regardless, I do think this series does a great job remixing aspects of various comic runs, pieces of the larger Marvel universe, and the alternate MCU framework into something recognizable but new. I will say, watching the first time, I was a bit disappointed by the fact that this first big action sequence we see is a Doctor Strange fight scene. Granted, we did get at least this very cool Venom symbiote over some kind of other alien, which at least gave it some cool Spidey flair, and the way this loop closes at the end of the season does end up wildly satisfying, but in the moment, I was a little bummed. But as I mentioned earlier, all of these events set into motion the big changes for Peter's surroundings in this universe. He saves and meets Nico during this fight, and the destruction sends him off to a new high school, leading to his new supporting cast and the event where he saves Harry. And I love how Peter's relationship with this new cast of characters are both familiar and subversive. For one, Peter's crush on Pearl is definitely reminiscent of his crush on Liz Allen in Homecoming. This Peter has a friendly family history with Pearl, but both Pearl and Liz are older classmates who Peter crushes on. In this universe, Nico sort of takes on the Ned role, his closest confidant and also someone who encourages Peter to move out of his comfort zone a bit, pretty immediately urging Peter to actually ask out Pearl.
Pearl's never gonna know that you feel that way about her unless you tell her.
But my favorite role is absolutely Lonnie Lincoln. He asks out Pearl before Peter, and you're sort of anticipating an antagonistic relationship with Peter, more akin to Flash Thompson in the comics or other shows, or the Raimi/Webb movies. A jock who gets the girl Peter likes and looks down on Peter for being a dork. But as it turns out, Lonnie is one of the best dudes imaginable, and rather than feel threatened, he actually respects Peter based on Pearl's positive judgment of him.
Pearl said you're a smart dude.
She said that?
Yeah, she mentioned you guys go back.
And this subversion and reveal that Lonnie is genuinely interested in being Peter's friend is when the episode reveals that Lonnie's true role in the show is far more prominent than you might expect. I said it before, but you genuinely could call him a co-lead, as they brilliantly parallel his journey becoming Tombstone alongside Peter's journey becoming Spider-Man. At this point, the episode fully abandons Peter and follows Lonnie on his commute back home to Harlem. It really showcases how integral he is in his family's life, supporting his brother with his schooling, going out of his way to try and diagnose his mom's car troubles to get it fixed. He's there every step of the way to help his family make ends meet.
Maybe we can avoid taking it in, save some money.
That would be a blessing. Thank you, Lonnie.
It's a brief sequence, but it was such a clear and intentional message that Lonnie's story was going to be important in this show, something that pays off in a wildly satisfying way as the season goes on. And the episode ends with the big inciting scene I mentioned earlier, the Stark swapped for Osborn scene at Peter's apartment, which begins what I think is a fascinating relationship dynamic with Old Norm. And I also like that, unlike in the MCU, Peter's internship is an actual internship in this. Granted, it had ulterior motives, but where the Stark internship was just Tony bizarrely recruiting a child to fight in a major political conflict, Norman actually puts Peter's knowledge to use within Oscorp, and it plays into the big season finale in a huge way. Because of the big Norman moment at the end of episode 1, it really feels like the show begins with a two-part premiere, with both of these first two episodes really laying down the groundwork for this Peter's world and circumstances. The first episode focuses a lot more on Peter's school life and classmates, while episode 2 really starts to lead into how Spidey will operate, while also establishing the sheer volume of things Peter has to balance in his life while being Spider-Man.
4 o'clock, unless you have another commitment.
Oh, me? No, nothing. I mean, what would I possibly have going on? I'm just a kid.
The Oscorp internship is also paid, a huge deal for Peter and May, who struggle to make ends meet. So alongside this being a huge opportunity for Peter's scientific aspirations, it's something he can't really say no to. I love how beyond stoked both May and Peter are after the offer. It's a really great moment of celebration between them. This one introduces us to the aforementioned fellow interns that Peter works with, as well as the Oscorp scientists, including this universe's future lizard, Dr. Carla Connors. Also, this Dr. Whitman character, a real asshole played by Paul F. Tompkins. I'm a massive Tompkins fan, but if I'm being honest, this feels like a little bit of a miscast to me. The voice doesn't quite fit the character model in my mind, but he plays this majorly antagonistic role as the head of the interns, where Connors is very supportive and nurturing, which hopefully will make her impending lizardification more impactful. I think this episode also makes some really cool parallels to Spider-Man Homecoming. I keep using the term remix, and I'm sorry, I'll probably use it a lot more, but I appreciate how this show kind of draws comparisons to moments in the MCU without recreating creating them outright. And in some cases later in the season, even fulfills some promises that the MCU Spidey trilogy failed to deliver on. But in this episode, after Lonnie's major football victory, Nico and Peter are invited to the celebratory party, not unlike how Ned and Peter were invited to Liz's party in Homecoming. Nico won't go without Peter, and he promises that he's going to make it. This is one of those first instances in the show of Peter's Spidey life adversely affecting his social life. He jumps into action to stop an arsonist and save a bunch of puppies and other animals, and of course, he misses the party. Classic Spider-Man. Nico feels let down and uncomfortable being at the party without her supportive friend, not unlike Ned in Homecoming after Peter bailed for Spidey action. Obviously, this is also kind of a big concept in Across the Spider-Verse, but it seems like they're pretty intentionally playing these moments as parallels to ones we're familiar with in the MCU, among other places. But this episode has another really great final cliffhang beat.
So, you're Spider-Man.
Honestly, Peter changing into his costume inside Oscorp was an incredibly stupid thing to do. Maybe one of the dumbest things we've seen a Peter Parker do, but I guess we'll let it slide for, the sake of the ongoing plot. These first two episodes are a lot of table setting, and I understand why after the premiere people weren't fully on board with this series, but it definitely seems like setting all of these pieces up on the chessboard properly paid off, because most fans really seem to have been fully won over as the season progressed, myself included. But let's talk a bit about Norman Osborn in this world, and I'm excited to dive into him more as we move through the season, because I think they've painted a really nuanced portrait for this version of the character. First off, the performance by Coleman Domingo is incredible. I would honestly love to see them move him into the live action role. Dude has been nominated for an Oscar for 2 consecutive years, and he gave my favorite performance in my favorite episode of BoJack Horseman for my fellow horseheads out there. But I love that Norman doesn't come across as just purely evil in this. He is absolutely self-serving and driven by corporate interest, and he has a very skewed perspective on life that nearly leads Peter astray, but I buy that this Norman still actually cares about Peter and Harry. He lets business and his personal vendettas get in the way of that sometimes, but I fully believe that he's grateful to Peter/Spidey for saving Harry.
From that day, I vowed I would find Spider-Man and repay him for saving Harry's life.
There are also other moments later in the season where Norm puts Peter's well-being above immediate success or progress. That obviously isn't to say he's a good guy, just that his motivations aren't purely evil. I think painting Norm as a more caring father who has wandered down a selfish path makes that eventual Green Goblin transformation far more meaningful. This is sort of how things are portrayed back in Raimi's first Spider-Man film, though I think committing more time to Norman's mentorship of Peter and his relationship with Harry pre-Goblin will make this a much more impactful fall from grace. And speaking of mentorship, that is what ends up being established after the Spidey revelation for Norm. He has a private dinner with Peter and reveals that the internship was mostly a cover to determine which of the smartest kids in New York was actually helping Spidey out with his equipment, not realizing that one of them was actually Spidey. And Norman's intention here is to fully back and support Peter's Spider-Man ambitions, funding his tech, his equipment, his new suits, and giving him the intel he needs to be a more effective hero. And obviously to use him for some of his own personal endeavors as well. This third episode is where we really start to see the parallels between Peter and Lonnie's stories, and I particularly love the way they portray Lonnie's sort of catch-22 scenario here. Lonnie's brother gets arrested after joining a gang called the 110. His mother is furious and distraught, and the show has already established the lengths Lonnie goes to help his family when they really need it. So when Lonnie tries to go get Dre out of there and the gang leader, Big Don, won't let him leave, Lonnie opts to take Dre's place in the 110, to put his schoolwork and sports prospects on the line, sacrificing his own time and well-being in order to make sure his brother gets put on the right path. Parallel to this story in this episode, Peter is very reluctant to accept Norman's help, but during a street fight with a tech-sporting couple, Norm hops on the headset and acts as Spidey's guy in the chair to great success. The end of the episode shows Peter shaking Norm's hand and accepting his help, and Lonnie shaking Big Don's hand, joining the family.
Welcome to the team, Mr. Osborn.
Welcome to the 110, Lonnie Lincoln.
The beginning of their parallel arcs. Both characters embrace support systems that have the potential to send them down the wrong path, and with Lonnie potentially mortgaging his future with the 110, it makes this line from him in the first episode hit a lot harder.
People think I'm destined to go pro or something, but I'd rather have options.
As we'll see, though he may find support and community within the 110, options are one thing he's not really afforded. Before we dive further into those parallel arcs, which there's lots to say about, let's talk about the villains this season. Obviously, the show is seeding eventual Spidey Rogues Gallery staples staples like Venom, Norman, and Doc Connors, but I was really impressed with which villains were focused on and how they were used. While he isn't the primary villain, Doc Ock plays this facilitation role across the season, basically building and distributing all of the weapons and tech that the villains who do get out into the streets are using in their criminal dealings. I particularly love this use because it gives Ock an important and menacing role across all of these episodes without wasting him too early in a Spidey face-off. In fact, I don't think Ock and Spidey ever even come face to face in this season, but Ock's string pulling does deeply affect Peter, as you'll see. I also appreciate Ock's connection with Norman, basically as a disgruntled former collaborator. It makes sense for the character, and it also works as yet another MCU parallel where Spidey villains like Mysterio were disgruntled Stark collaborators. Interestingly, it sort of paints Ock as the more radical one in this scenario, as though he was too ambitious and reckless with their experiments, where Norman was a little more cautious. And knowing how reckless Norm is by the end of this season, this could be saying a lot about what Ock is capable of. Octavius's design is perfect, it's straight out of the Ditko comics, and we also don't actually get to see Doc in full octopus regalia yet. We do see his arm tech as defense in his makeshift lab, but never the 8-limbed villain in all his glory. So though he had a very cool presence in the show, they're still saving the best for later. And as I said, Ock is basically facilitating almost all of the villains. There's a group of Russian criminals who end up being the Unicorn, Chameleon, and though he hasn't gotten there yet, this dude is obviously going to be the Rhino. They do a good job setting up these characters and utilizing them in various ways across the season, rather than just sort of blowing them in a single episode. But I can't talk about the Rogues Gallery this season without absolutely raving about Scorpion. Not only because the execution was wildly impressive, but because this is basically the series making up for the failed tease in Spider-Man Homecoming.
It's not on you. It's on our little spider friend.
If you don't remember, Michael Mando played Mac Gargan in that film, and the post-credit scene heavily teases Mac as Scorpion planning his Spidey vengeance. Obviously, this was never followed up as the next film focused on Mysterio and the following on the previous Spider-Man's villains crossing universes. Scorpion is such an iconic villain, and the fact that he hasn't been in any live-action Spidey film properly is kind of a bummer, but damn does this show go a really long way to show the promise of this version of the character. Mac Gargan is designed after Michael Mando, introduced as a rival gang leader to the 110, and he utilizes Ock's tech to become a true threat as Scorpion. Truly, the action sequences that center on him are some of the best in the entire season. He is so menacing, so scary, so cool, and his role as the primary obstacle to Peter's growth as Spidey is really well realized. But it's cool to see how this series is not only making these conscious parallels to the films it's offshooting from, but even exploring the paths those films could have taken themselves. The only thing that gives Peter more grief than his Rogues Gallery are the pitfalls of maintaining his social life while trying to be Spidey, and this season does a great job embracing that impossible balance with his new surrounding cast. Though in this world Peter is best friends with Nico, his friendship with Harry sort of gets forcibly pushed to the next level pretty quickly, mostly because he accidentally reveals his Spidey secret to him at Oscorp.
But it was so awesome! We have a winner, Mr. Osborn.
Holy crap, you're Spider-Man.
I'm gonna sound like a broken record, but once again, this is a little parallel to the MCU Spidey, who accidentally revealed his alter ego to Ned as well, and both Ned and Harry end up being Peter's guy-in-the-chair support. Interesting that Norman so willingly thrusts his son into the Spidey business, but because of this dynamic, Peter and Harry get to know each other very quickly. And because Harry knows Peter's secret, Peter can be fully open with him in a way that he felt he couldn't with Nico. I appreciated that alongside Peter just struggling to make his social obligations while being Spider-Man, other unexpected social developments that stemmed from him being Spidey caused drama in his personal life as well. Namely, that really quick friendship with Harry causing a ton of jealousy in Nico. And I also appreciate that it's not just some black and white jealousy issue. Nico also has her own misconceptions about Harry that cause her to judge him before she really knows him. Which, to be fair, stems from his rich kid Instagram persona, but she was pretty stubborn about giving Harry a chance at all.
Look, if you guys just spend a little time together, I think you'll become super good friends.
Oh yeah? How did you arrive at that conclusion, Mr. Matchmaker?
I do think there are maybe aspects of this drama that unfolds that feel a tiny bit contrived, but I think the core of it is super well realized. It's super relatable, super understandable, and it was once again pretty frustrating to see so much misguided discourse about Nico after this event. Harry thinks that Nico might know Peter's Spidey secret and spills the beans, and when Nico realizes that he isn't lying to her, she feels super hurt and betrayed by Peter. And of course, this is something that would bother Nico, and it's not just that she feels she's owed this reveal from Peter. It's the fact that he didn't tell her, but did tell his brand new friend Harry. It's a completely justified feeling of jealousy that Peter felt comfortable enough to tell his new friend, but not his best friend. All, of course, before she understands the real ramifications of what knowing that secret means, and also that Harry wasn't exactly told the secret, he found out on accident. And I think fittingly, it's Harry who goes out of his way to make things right with Nico, becoming actual friends in the process, and also helping her better understand why Peter might have been worried about revealing that secret to someone he cares about so deeply.
It's one thing to risk your own life, but it's another thing to be willing to risk the people closest to you.
I think these sequences go a really long way to help us understand these characters and their motivations, and I particularly loved Harry opening up to Nico, allowing us and Nico herself to better understand the expectations that might come with Harry's fame and why he's latched on to Peter as his new friend.
Peter is actually the first friend I've had in a while that wasn't trying to use me for money or likes.
Overall, I just think the show does a great job with its characters and the friendship/relationship dynamics that come with them. Even with characters that aren't traditionally in the Spidey mix, it still hits all of those same themes that are vital to any Spidey story really impactfully. I also appreciate that while the show utilizes the Marvel Universe and MCU adjacent world as a backdrop, it doesn't often feel like it's straying too far from the Spidey-centric stuff. In fact, it seems like it uses the surrounding universe way less than the MCU Spidey movies. Obviously, this takes place alongside the Civil War event, meaning Cap is on the run and Iron Man is falling in line with the government and the Sokovia Accords. I did think it was a funny touch to have Nico debating the morality of each side like the fans of the MCU do themselves.
I've never been a Tony Stark fan.
Right.
But I can't say Captain America is totally in the right either.
Also pretty funny that in this universe, Peter is just a huge Captain America fan. I mean, we know he was also a fan in the MCU via dialogue in Civil War, but the fact that he was so connected to Tony Stark in that universe definitely makes his overt fanaticism towards Cap seem kind of intentional here. On the writing side, they even make it pretty clear that his blue and red color scheme was inspired by Cap's costume. Iron Man only shows up a single time all season, and I think the way they did this was also pretty intentional. He's called in by General Ross, who still looks like William Hurt and not Harrison Ford, by the way, and he helps bring in Doc Ock. And I think this helps show how formidable Ock is, that it required the big guns to take him in, and also withheld our first real Spidey/Ock face-off for a bigger moment down the line. But Daredevil, though? Man, my only complaint about Daredevil in this season is that I wanted more of him. Charlie Cox reprises his role as he investigates Oscorp, giving us one of the coolest and most atmospheric fights in the entire series. I love the way he's sort of trying to mentor and give advice to Peter as he fights him, hinting that Osborn isn't trustworthy.
I can tell you're young, you're trying to do the right thing, but this isn't it.
And hopefully this means we get a lot more Daredevil next year, which it seems like we will based on some of the end of season teases. People have been clamoring for Daredevil and Spidey street level adventures forever now. I'm still holding out hope that we'll see that in the MCU's Spider-Man 4 as well, but this series feels like a great place to get Daredevil more involved. Not to mention he just looks great in this animation style, particularly this black suit in the moonlight, really pulling for a full-on Daredevil Spidey team-up in season 2. The use of Doctor Strange is also pretty interesting. While I was annoyed by it in the premiere, it ended up serving a fundamentally important piece to the puzzle of the season, and I really loved how it paid off in the end. I'll talk more about that with the last episode. But I also appreciated that they chose to seed the beginnings of this friendship with Strange, which feels like a nod to their friendship in No Way Home. I'm also a huge fan of the way Spidey's suit evolved over the course of this season. For one, this homemade suit is very cool, very unique, still feels homemade, but aesthetically much better than the MCU homemade Spidey suit, with a real focus on how the early version of the web shooter tech isn't as practical. But I really love that the next real suit he sports is basically the future Foundation suit, but in this universe created by Norman/Oscorp. For one, I just think it's a great suit, but really what I love about how it's used here is that while it is a cool Spidey suit, the fact that it was made by Norman in this more corporate environment for Spidey makes the fact that it seems sort of sterile and lacking in personality really hit home thematically. It's a great suit practically. It has a lot of the Spidey hallmarks, but when Peter is working for Oscorp, he simply isn't a Spidey that has reached his potential and purpose. It isn't until he finds himself and his place as a hero outside of Norm's corporate system that he can don the real Spidey suit designed by himself and manufactured by Harry. That's good stuff. Also love that the first reveal of this suit is while he's saving Nico, which is also this big moment that really helps her understand the reality of Peter's double life. Okay, I think it's time to finally lay out these full parallel Peter and Lonnie arcs, it's for sure one of the things I loved most about this season. I already laid out how Peter and Lonnie join up with Norman in the 110 simultaneously, but across the season, they seem to hit a lot of these most important milestones at the exact same time, starting with just the realization that their partnerships with Norm in the 110 both offer a real sense of support and community, albeit in different ways. In episode 105, The Unicorn Unleashed, we have pretty major moments for both characters, the first time they're really put to the test within these new circumstances. Unicorn is the first real dangerous villain that Peter has to face off against, while Lonnie experiences his first real turf war with a rival gang against the Scorpions, led of course by Mac Gargan. If I had one thing to critique about this, and I understand that this is fully because the show is meant to be enjoyed by kids as well, but these gangs just throwing hands feels a little silly. Just a full-on fist fight brawl from street gangs feels a little disingenuous, especially when we see them secure firearms later, which we also barely see them use. But again, it's a complaint about something that I at least understand from a production standpoint. It would have been a little too violent if they just started shooting each other. The purpose of this fight in the narrative still shines through regardless. While fighting Unicorn, she starts to just target civilians, realizing that Spidey's need to save bystanders is something that she can exploit. She actually ends up targeting her own comrade, Mikhail, gambling that Spidey would save him, which he of course did. It's a pretty great moment, sacrificing his own well-being to save the life of somebody who is an actual criminal and doesn't have Spidey's best interest at heart. To me, this is the moment in the show where Peter really starts to understand and realize what it means to be Spider-Man. Played simultaneously during the 110/Scorpion brawl, Lonnie stops Gargan from blindsiding Big Don with a knife, sacrificing his own well-being for his gang leader, a guy who frankly also doesn't really deserve that level of loyalty from Lonnie, which also puts Lonnie on Mac's hit list. But both of these events reveal the core of both Peter and Lonnie's characters, the strength of their moral fiber, and represents them both making significant steps up in their respective paths.
We should call you Tombstone.
There are plenty of other parallels across the season as well, both Peter and Lonnie alienating those closest to them because they aren't willing to fully let them in on their world, with Nico and Pearl. They both have these simultaneous, oh, this just got real moments when Scorpion attacks the 110, where some of Lonnie's gangmates are killed, Pearl is put in serious danger, and Peter is impaled and nearly murdered. This is also one of the best fights in the series. It's just insanely cool. Scorpion is incredibly scary here, and this leads to a hugely important turning point for both characters, where Lonnie has to be willing to leave Pearl behind if he wants to continue down the 110 path, and thanks to a conversation with Norman, Peter has to really figure out what kind of hero he wants to be. This is maybe the crux of the whole season, and I'll talk about it shortly in relation to the climax of the season. And then in the penultimate episode of the season, these journeys reach their conclusion, and damn is it satisfying. This is the episode where Peter dons the classic suit for the first time, representing the culmination of the season 1 journey. Meanwhile, during yet another Scorpion face-off, Big Don absolutely bails on the 110, showing his true colors and paving the way for Lonnie to step up and support his new family, which then also leads to Lonnie getting hit with the gas that grants him the near invulnerability he's known for in the comics as his alter ego Tombstone. And as they both reach their potential, they team up against Scorpion. Obviously at this point Peter knows who Lonnie is, but Lonnie doesn't know that Spidey is Peter. But after a great sequence where they seemingly take down Mac, a cheap shot from him makes it look like Lonnie is crushed to death in battle, sending Peter fully over the edge. Okay, let's back it up a tiny bit, because this sequence requires some important context, and it's one of the things I appreciated most about this season. Obviously, we know that in this universe, Peter seemingly did not get his with great power comes great responsibility moment from Uncle Ben. And though Peter did often exhibit this mindset in the MCU, he didn't really get this moment until May died in No Way Home. Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man actually opts to first deliver Peter an adverse lesson from Norman.
With great power comes great respect. And if you don't have respect, you have nothing.
Norman has shown so much support towards Peter in so many ways, mentoring him through these early stages of being Spider-Man, and this comes right after Peter suffered his most brutal, traumatizing defeat. And so, it makes so much sense that Peter would be more vulnerable to accepting this advice at this moment. Norman basically tells Peter that he needs to stop pulling punches, and that he needs to be ruthless and exhibit the extent of his abilities, and that the respect earned from this power will allow him to rise to the next level of heroism, lead him down the path of being a truly great hero. And after Lonnie is seemingly crushed, Peter nearly gives in to this advice in a moment that I think is very intentionally paralleling the one at the end of Spider-Man No Way Home. With Norman's advice ringing in his head, Peter absolutely wallops Scorpion, stops pulling his punches entirely, driven by vengeance, with civilians looking on in horror. And just like how Peter nearly impales Norman with the very glider that killed Aunt May in No Way Home, Peter nearly impales Scorpion with his own tail, the tail that nearly killed him earlier in the season. And both of these incidents were egged on by Norman Osborn. In this one, through the advice he received as a mentor figure, and in No Way Home, just coming directly from his mouth during the fight. I'm gonna say it again, remix. Here, Lonnie is the one who talks sense into Peter, really solidifying their parallel journeys, and again highlighting Lonnie's moral fiber.
You don't want to be like him. People look up to you. Don't throw that away.
I think this was meant to be advice born of Lonnie's own experience as well. Since he joined the 110, his public image and his reputation have taken a real hit, even though he's a good guy trying to do the right thing in tough situations. I appreciate that this series shows that falling into this lifestyle isn't necessarily always just as simple as making a choice to be a criminal. Lonnie made his decision to protect his loved ones, putting his own future on the line. But by the end of the season, he's risen the ranks not because he's ruthless, but because he actually proved that he cares for his people like family. He takes care of them like Big Don wouldn't. And what I love most about Peter nearly taking Norman's great respect advice is that Peter realizes that the adverse is the truth. Through nearly playing out this scenario, it helps him understand that with great power actually comes great responsibility. That if he had attempted to garner the respect Norman insisted that he did, he would have let so many people down, completely neglecting the responsibility that is so core to the character. The episode wraps up these arcs in such a neat bow. However, the season isn't over, and the season finale serves as such a great capper, sort of closing the loop on some big questions for the season. Peter decides to stop working with Norman and starts working directly with Harry instead, which then reveals that Norman was using Peter's blood to try and recreate the spiders that gave him his abilities. And, as it turns out, Norman's Oscorp intern projects were all in aid of building this portal device so they can instantaneously move anywhere in the universe. This ultimately ties into the very beginning of the entire show in a really cool way. Doctor Strange shows up to try and warn Norman about what he's doing, he turns the gate on anyway, and bam! Symbiote, the same one we saw in the Midtown High fight in the very first episode. The reveal here is that the events of that episode stemmed from these events, as the Time Stone took Strange and the symbiote back to Midtown High, setting all of the events of this season in motion. On top of that, the spider that bit Peter was one of the Oscorp spiders that were made from Peter's blood. This is an example of a bootstrap paradox, where the time travel event causes itself to in fact occur. This loop of Peter getting his abilities has no discernible origin. The spider gave Peter his powers, but the spider could only give powers to Peter because of Peter's blood that was injected into it after the spider gave Peter those powers. And also the fact that all of the events of this season played out differently because of the events of the end of the season. It all just loops back in on itself. I thought this is a really fun reveal for the final episode of the season, personally. We also see this massive symbiote Hydra thing, and they barely lock it back behind the gate before it escapes onto Earth. A really cool final battle for season 1, and I like that they found multiple ways to tease Venom here. This final episode also teases like almost an unbelievable number of story threads, but it really means the show has so many places it could go. Harry sends out invites for his new company that will operate with Spidey, with names on the list that include Ned Leeds and Max Dillon, among others, might I add. We learn that the intern Jean is actually Finesse and is working with Daredevil. We get a tease of Nico's magical abilities as she seemingly communes with her dead mother. Ock pretty blatantly designs his arms in prison. Wonder why they're letting him do that, honestly. Norman discovers a tiny piece of the symbiote left over from the big gateway battle, likely leading to some Black Suit and or Venom action next year. And maybe the craziest of all, May goes to visit Richard Parker in prison, played by spectacular Spidey himself, Josh Keaton. Actually kind of shocked they're pursuing a Peter's parents storyline, but especially with Josh Keaton in the role, I'm really excited to see where they go with this. And with all of these teases for what's to come, there's one other thing I really want to speculate about for season 2, which is confirmed to be coming next year. Showrunner Jeff Trammell revealed that next year we will be seeing Gwen Stacy in the show, which was initially met with huge fanfare. But then it was also revealed that her Spider-Woman/Ghost Spider persona will also be featured, which was met with less fanfare, largely because I think people are just pining for simpler stories with Peter's classic surrounding cast. However, I actually think based on what the show has established, this could be a really interesting development for season 2, especially given how successful this first season was with that remix mindset. We know that Oscorp has bred these spiders with Peter's blood that can create new spider people. We also know that Norm was pitching the Spider Person project to the government via General Ross, and that Peter has quit his work with Osborn, jeopardizing that potential contract. Obviously, Norman is going to want to rectify this somehow, and so another incredibly smart, science-focused student coming in and taking Peter's place as Norman's protege Spidey sure makes a ton of sense to me. Not to mention, this likely web bomb sure does look a lot like a pumpkin bomb, and they already teased that glider a whole bunch. I also think the show for sure has the potential to mix and match aspects of various Spidey timelines here. I honestly wouldn't even hate it if we saw aspects of Peter's flirtation and relationship with Gwen play out in a world where she is also Ghost Spider, particularly when her role is likely going to be so tied to Norman, aka the one responsible for classic Gwen Stacy's death. I just think there are a lot of interesting possibilities, and if this team has proven anything to me, it's that they're very creative with the ways they intertwine these stories and characters. Norman also has that symbiote on hand. Maybe the next variation we'll see is Gwenom? Who knows? But the last thing I want to talk about is this line Peter delivers to Doctor Strange and what it means to be Spider-Man.
I believe that things that are supposed to happen always find a way to happen. Sometimes they make sense, sometimes they don't.
I think this line could be read as almost antithetical to the idea of Spider-Man, in the same way that my least favorite aspect of The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is antithetical to the idea of Spider-Man. Peter only became Spidey in that film because he had Parker blood. It was less of a coincidence. He was the only one who could have gotten those powers in that world, which takes away from the "this could have happened to anyone" aspect of the Spider-Man mythos, that this great power was thrust upon an unsuspecting kid, and he responded to that great power by using great responsibility. But I think this delivery gives a bit more leeway than that. It doesn't necessarily imply that Peter was always meant to be Spider-Man. I think in this context, it simply means that in this universe, this Spider-Man still became the hero he was meant to, despite drastically different circumstances. Even though the events of this season, because of those time travel shenanigans, play out very differently than the classic Peter Parker legend, or the MCU Spidey, or most of the other adaptations we've seen, through these different events, he still reached a place where he is the hero we recognize and love. He still learned those lessons he needed to be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, even though those lessons came differently. And I even think this idea is pretty complementary to the MCU Spidey as well. It sort of took 3 movies to fully get him to that full Spidey place, but the things that were supposed to happen found a way to happen. And while I'll always understand that many fans pine for the more traditional story beats and casts of characters, for me, with so many different adaptations already existing, I welcome a bit of change for the new adaptations, as long as they don't betray the core of the character. And this one absolutely understands who Peter Parker is, to the point where they were able to dismantle the Spider-Man mythos to its core values and then rebuild it, leading Peter to become the Spider-Man we know and love in a new way. He is still your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.
I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.